Hello, my name is Jonathan Bryce Roby. This is my student ID, and this presentation is for the presentation of main topics. Chapter 1 mostly talked about biological factors and how learning is a mechanism of biology. It talked about Darwin and his trip on the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands, which raised questions about complex systems like the eye or the brain, and how could those things arise out of evolution. It would take thousands, if not millions of years. And Darwin actually agreed with that question, but there are things in nature, like the jellyfish, that are simple sets of neurons that show that complex systems can come from simple systems. So there was no real hole there in that. Then, Chapter 2 talked about ways to measure learning, and that one of the best ways to measure learning is to measure the decrease in errors that someone has in a given behavior. This brought up, like, how can you test this, which led to animal testing, which briefly in the chapter was brought up, like ethical issues on experimenting on animals. But I think the main concept to take away from this chapter was that you can study animals and their behavior, and that you can apply that to people. Chapter 3, that began the conversation with Pavlovian conditioning, and it talked about how the famous Pavlov's dog, how he conditioned the stimulus in the dog for it to begin salivating at the sound of a bell when it used to salivate when he presented it with food. So he paired what would become a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned response until he conditioned the stimulus of the bell ringing and the dog salivating. It also talked about little Albert and the rat, where the rat started out as a neutral stimulus and became a conditioned stimulus, which elicited a conditioned response, because initially little Albert was not afraid of the rat, but by pairing the loud noise, which is an unconditioned stimulus or response, I forget the terminology on that one, it causes fear or reaction. We're all born with that as an instinct. By pairing that loud noise with the rat, they were able to condition little Albert to be afraid of the rat. Chapter 4 talked about, it's been a little while, Pavlov's findings and how to apply them. And I think there were 7 different things that you could apply them to, which were fear, advertising, taste aversion, paraphilia, prejudice, healthcare, and I'm forgetting one. Drug addiction, which is actually a really neat way to study behaviorism, because in drug addiction, then you start to see how there are antecedents to behaviors and there are consequences to behaviors, which leads into behaviorism. So in this chapter, chapter 4, we started to see the beginnings of behaviorism. So that would lead into chapter 5, which was B.F. Skinner, which is behaviorism. And he talked a lot about how a behavior can be made stronger or weaker based on its consequences. This was all derived a lot from the reflexes. I don't know if reflexology would be the correct term there. I guess that would be the study of reflexes that came from evolution theory up through Pavlov to B.F. Skinner. So all of this, Skinner was building off of prior knowledge. And in chapter 5, it also talked about, because we're dealing a lot with behaviors, we're trying to figure out what motivates certain behaviors. And so we talked about Hall's drive reduction theory, which states that man tries to stay at a pretty equal level of equilibrium, at a homeostasis. And that when man is not at this state of homeostasis, something called a drive is induced on the man, which motivates the man or person, woman, into being in a certain state, such as, let's say that you're thirsty. Hall's drive reduction theory would say that this is interrupting your equilibrium, your homeostasis. So now you're going to have the drive, which will motivate you to get water. And there are primary and secondary drives. Primary drives are things that, like an instinct, which are intrinsic to your need to survive, typically referred to as like feeding, the four F's, um, is a colloquial euphemism. And so the primary would be like, I'm thirsty, I need water. And the secondary would be, well, now I've learned that I can quench my thirst with Coca-Cola, and I really like that better than water, so I'm going to seek out Coca-Cola. Let's see. Chapter 6 discussed shaping behaviors, which is actually something that strikes close to home with me because I work with adults with severe behavioral issues that also suffer from autism, ranging somewhere on the autism spectrum disorder scale. And we engage in one of the things that was mentioned in this chapter, which is chaining, which is a way to shape behaviors. So what we'll do in like a laundry, we call these programs, is to shape, we reinforce consecutive, kind of iterative steps within a process. So say that I have a hypothetical patient, because I can't obviously disclose that information, by the name of Mark. And Mark's full program is to fully fold a towel. And in this program, we've broken it up into 10 steps because we found that for Mark, he works best breaking things up into as simple shaping steps as possible. So I reinforce each one of these steps until Mark can fully complete folding the towel, and that's chaining to create that full set of behaviors. Now, what I found, and I believe it talked about this briefly in the book, but I may be thinking of other courses that I'm taking right now or have taken in the past, to be honest, is that the size of the reinforcer doesn't actually need to be that big. In fact, if you have a very large reinforcer, sometimes if you give too big of a reinforcer for maybe, it's hard to quantify this, but too small of a step in a chaining or a shaping device within a program, you might actually undermine the rest of that shaping within the chain of behaviors, or the rest of that chain, by having too grand of a reinforcer at just a certain stage. So sometimes just verbal praise like, way to go, bud, or like a single Tootsie Roll will actually be more motivating and more reinforcing than if you were to give somebody like an entire bag of popcorn. Also, it's important to note there that for a lot of these clients, everything they do is pretty much a program that we run with them, like showering, completing those things. So all of that has to be taken into account. And working in this field, I didn't realize how much I was using these techniques that had been come up with by B.F. Skinner, himself, and had been come through all these stages of evolution, like from evolution theory through like Pavlov's reflex theory, building into behaviorism, which I'm sure it's going to build even further from there, which I think next week probably get into some kind of cognitive behaviorism, which I'm excited to get into. But I think I've covered everything for the chapters that we've covered so far in class. Thank you for your time and patience.